thank you, Jules, for taking the time out, especially to talk on conspirituality, because if in terms of an origin story, I can point to you as the reason that I found out about the term. I think it was something around February. And I became fascinated by the research that you pulled from that, both your story and then Charlotte Ward's research with David Avoas. And from there, that kicked off. I wrote an article about Big Think for Big Think about that, citing you in the original paper, but just the term. But this, I didn't know that it had a name, but it's something that I've thought about for a long time. How did you come across the term in the first place?
That week.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, yeah. I've been I write kind of history of ideas pieces, and I work in a place called the Center for the History of the Emotions, and I've been researching. I wrote a book about the history of ecstatic experiences, and I'm writing a book about the history of kind of New Age spirituality and the human potential movement, based around the life of Aldous Huxley. I began to look at conspiracy theories. They were a little bit on my radar of my research, but basically because, how to put it, I guess in my research, I came across some of the dark side of New Age spirituality and the overlap between New Age spirituality and eugenics. So the fact that Aldous Huxley was quite into eugenics and his brother Julian Huxley was very into eugenics. And through that got me into some like right-wing conspiracy theory books from the 90s, particularly like Christian fundamentalist conspiracy theories, who, had this very paranoid view of New Age spirituality, that actually they're all trying to, it's all these people, this hidden elite trying to create a one world government, and trying to control the population, and trying to kind of brainwash us and get us all to accept some kind of global spirituality. And I realized that they weren't entirely wrong, that this conspiracy theory had some kind of accuracy to it. So this year I've been beginning to kind of look at conspiracy theories. And then basically in short, at the start of the lockdown, I, like you, saw a massive rise in conspiracy theories. It was in March and April, just after we were all stuck at home and just in front of our computers. And I saw people I quite respected in New Age spirituality circles coming out and saying COVID is a hoax, and using their platforms to promote people like David Icke, who I considered very fringe. So I knew I wanted to write something about it, and it was basically that week that I just came across the term conspirituality in some of the papers, and it perfectly encapsulated what was happening. I guess what we both saw emerging in kind of March, April, which was people going from saying, hey, be true to yourself and let your inner light shine, to saying, this is a scam and don't trust the government, and COVID was made up. So I wrote that piece, and as soon as I posted it, I could see it just doing really well. And I guess it just, it was a nice little term for something that was happening.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. And I still see it now because people are discovering your essay still, and people are discovering our podcast, and it naming something gives it form. You don't have a concept until you give it a name. And at least once you have that umbrella, now you can start to understand, oh, I'm not crazy. There is actually something here. And in your essay, you write that you point out that the leading influencers in my community, Western spirituality, were going into this. And I'm just wondering who some of your influences are, both for your own work in the Center for Emotions, which I never knew existed. And I find that even that idea fascinating, but as well as your own practice or belief system.
Sorry, say it again. What's my practice or
So
belief
who are
system?
your influences? So before, like leading into this, when you talk about you coming from Western
Okay, so
spirituality,
where am I coming from?
yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. Um, well, I mean, my first book was about Stoicism.
Hmm.
So I wrote that like 2012 about the revival of Stoicism today. So I was very into Stoicism. So that kind of tradition. I organized like Stoic conferences and all that kind of thing. In terms of spirituality, I suppose Aldous Huxley and that kind of British Californian crossover. So people like Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts. My second book was about the history of ecstatic experiences, and Aldous Huxley was just a big influence on that. He was I was so impressed with his take on spiritual experiences, the way, he had a historical take on it. He was one of the first to say that Western society has kind of marginalized these experiences and pathologized them, and that this was a bad thing. He had a kind of spiritual theological take. He had a political take. He said we need to reorder British society, Western society, to create more space for contemplation. He really promoted this kind of fusion of what I call empirical spirituality, trying to use evidence-based techniques to test out different spiritual technologies, he called them. So he's a big influence on me, I would say.
I'm sure perhaps you've come across the book Amusing Ourselves to Death.
No.
Oh, well, that's why do I always forget his name? Uh, the author, I can't believe I'm remembering. He makes the argument, and I'll actually send this to you. His son did a piece a couple of years ago in The Guardian talking about this, about how we all point to Orwell in 1984 as being what has happened, where he makes the argument in the book that it's Huxley who really, because the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, it's like Huxley was like, there isn't this totalitarian government, it's the technologies that are, we're all these
Yeah.
toys are
Yeah.
coming about. Um,
We're happily doing it, where it's a kind of hedonic enslavement, uh,
yeah.
and
Now,
and an attention enslavement. I mean, he was writing in the 30s. This is the age of noise and the age of distraction, and it's pity he never, saw social media and
oh.
um, yeah. So
Well, that was
he,
the Guardian. Yeah, the Guardian piece talks about that from his son, talking about the evolution of that idea.
yeah.
But there's so much. I mean, I have a Marcus Aurelius quote right here. I have about 15 Alan Watts books right here. and
Yeah.
and then right here is, I wonder, in your book, and going a little aside now, but being a Huxley fan, if you're going to give Island the attention it deserves finally.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, I don't actually, I don't massively like Huxley as a novelist, and I think even his close friends said he wasn't a great novelist, and I think he knew it. But his ideas were amazing, and Michael Murphy, who founded Esalen, talks about Island as kind of an inspiration for Esalen as well, and maybe even he was an inspiration for Huxley, because Huxley wrote Island just around the time we first met Murphy, just when Murphy was setting up Esalen. But Island's an amazing book, and it's also interesting to look at Island and think that his utopia, his ideal society, is not that far, or at least has some similarities with his supposed dystopia, Brave New World. They're both completely static societies which don't change. They're in some ways, where people are very soaked in the traditions of their culture. In Brave New World, you have this kind of hidden radios repeating kind of, the wisdom of the tribe. Whilst in Island, you have these minor birds, saying here and now, and kind of. So I don't know. There are similarities. He was kind of. I mean, I adore Huxley, but there is a dark side to him and to his brother as well. He
Mhm.
was quite authoritarian, and he was quite elitist. And this is, I guess, what I'm exploring in this book is the elitism of spirituality, the idea of the Superman, you know, that we will develop our human potential. Us, the special people, will develop our human potential and become godlike. And then the flip side of that is there are other people who are kind of inferior, like and subhuman, and they should be kind of controlled and you know through things like population control or eugenics. So
Yeah.
it's, you know, there's just a fascinating, you know, overlap between the Huxley brothers and conspiracy culture. Let me give you two examples. So you know the tinfoil hat thing,
Hmm.
the classic symbol of conspiracy theories. So that comes from a short story by Julian Huxley from called the Culture Tissue King. So he came up with this idea of the kind of silly tinfoil hat. And the other thing is, you know, in the QAnon conspiracy theory, they believe that children are being harvested for adrenochrome.
Yes.
So that comes from Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, and then Hunter S. Thompson took it and turned it into this fictional drug,
Yes.
and now people think it's true. So there are just various ways where the kind of, you know, Huxley, the dreams of the Huxleys have become weird, you know,
Yeah.
beliefs in people's actual conspiracy theories.
I knew that about adrenochrome. I didn't know that connection with Julian though. That's fascinating. And
Yeah.
and the talking about Island wasn't a total aside because it sort of reminds me of Dante. You know, everyone remembers Inferno, but it was a trilogy. But we tend to focus on the dystopia. And the same thing has happened with Huxley. And I agree with you about his novel writing, but his ideas are fascinating. But you
Mm.
also recently wrote about Krishnamurti. And so
Yeah.
talking about California spirituality, and what was fascinating was that theosophy also intersected with politics, going, and it went from anti-colonialism or pro-colonialism to anti-colonialism. And Krishnamurti had a big part in the role of actually, you know, deconstructing theosophy in the end. But
Mm-hmm.
it makes me wonder, you know, and I want to get to your piece on Nazis and relating to
Mm-hmm.
yoga and vegetarianism as well, but to conspiritualists and what you're noticing right now, what is their utopia? Like, what does it look like? Have you noticed any patterns of what this supposed great awakening, this thing we're moving into, actually is?
Mm. Um, well, I mean, I said in that conspirituality piece that you can think of, in some ways, a paranoid conspiracy theory is like it's like a mystical experience but flipped. So a mystical experience is the sense of we are all connected, we are all one. We are the kind of the elite. The universe is working through us. Everything is happening for a reason, and it's all good. And you know, the conspiracy theories are kind of, it's a bit like what William James called paranoid mysticism. Everything is connected. There is a hidden elite, but I'm outside of it, and this hidden elite is controlling me. Nothing happens by chance. They control everything about it. So it's a bit like a bad trip version of the good trip of kind of, you know, a euphoric mystical experience. So I think its main mood is one of paranoia and horror and fear and loathing at the present system and the evil people controlling it. But I suppose there is this kind of I don't know. There's a sense. I mean, look, there are different types of conspirituality theories. If you read David Icke, have you ever read a kind of David? I actually struggled through a couple of them recently, and they're so long because like many conspiracy theories, why say, you know, why say in one page what you can say in 100 pages? So they're kind of like graphomania. They like, you know, it
Yeah.
links everything together. You just it's this all-encompassing theory of everything. It's like that classic picture of a wall with just like pieces of paper stuck and lines going to all the pieces of paper. But so he, I mean, it's amazing reading his books, he has like basically 500 pages about how there's this evil lizard elite controlling everything and enslaving us all. And it's a very dark picture. And then he has like 50 pages at the end where he says, but actually we are creatures of light and we are divine. And all we need to do is to change our beliefs and attitudes and we will be free and all is love. And so that's the kind of Gnostic hope, but it's so outweighed by the dark stuff in his vision. You know, you think, well, what hope is there of liberation if we're completely controlled by this alien species? So in him, there is this kind of glimmer of hope of some kind of Gnostic liberation. And it's a very Gnostic kind of vision, the idea that, you know, the universe, we're basically enslaved by some kind of archons or some kind of other beings. And then in, I think, something like QAnon, it reminds me of the kind of millenarian conspiracy that really flourished, like maybe in the late Middle Ages or in the Reformation. Similar kind of time where you had a breakdown in the ruling myth of our society, a breakdown in the kind of church's monopoly on truth, similar to now we have a kind of breakdown of TV's monopoly on truth. So this flourishing of alternate realities. And what you get in QAnon is this idea that, you know, there is, we're in a time of trouble and suffering, but there is this messianic figure, this divinely inspired figure in Trump and some of his allies, and they will purge the landscape of the baddies. And there, you know, and there will be this, I guess, this kind of glorious age of peace and love afterwards. So in some ways, it's millenarian, a bit like Nazism. Like Nazism, this idea that we're being controlled by these evil demonic figures, but this glorious leader will purge the nation of these evil demons, and then there'll be 1,000-year Reich of peace and love. So I think it's that kind of theory. It's quite medieval in a way.
Well, we haven't really evolved as much as I think we do sometimes. I think everything that I look at is always through the lens of evolutionary biology. My background is in religious studies, and
right.
I wanted, at some point in my studies, I didn't just want to understand why people believe things. I wanted to know what made us believe in the first place. And then you have to look at biology, you have to look at history to understand that. So I started looking at everything through that lens. And we're still operating with very old operating systems, no matter how easily we talk to one another right now.
That's true. We love stories, and we love stories of good versus evil and myths. And I think, you know, maybe people who get drawn into conspiracy theories, maybe they have this kind of capacity of absorption where perhaps they get very absorbed in a story to the extent where they can't tell the difference between fiction and reality. So a lot of conspiracy theories, they have elements that they took from novels, or from sci-fi or from movies, and it's like they kind of leaped category and people started believing that they were really true. And you see that in religions as well. Something starts off as a story and then people start thinking it's really, really true. But I think it's also the case that conspiracy theories wouldn't spread unless they did have some truth to them, at least some grain of truth. And I suppose, you know, it is true that there are people with lots of power, lots more power than other people, and lots more money than other people. And there are people who feel really left behind, and kind of, you know, laughed at and exploited by more powerful people. And all of that is, you know, probably true. It's just, so the despair is real. The hardship is real, but the solution is totally magical. And in some ways, the kind of the analysis as well is not quite right. I mean, you know, yes, okay, maybe there is an elite exploiting people, but that doesn't mean that Tom Hanks is a satanic pedophile or something, you know.
One thing we talk about is the indoctrination process. And one thing I am fascinated by this is compared to old cults where there was a charismatic leader. First off, there's no leader. Second off, the indoctrination process happens so quickly and it's happening through hashtags. Now, you open your piece on Conspirituality talking about David Icke, but you also point out that he was on London Real. And I found Brian's show a few years ago when he interviewed Ido Portal. I also work in fitness and movement, and I love Ido Portal. So I was like, this is fascinating. And I was like, oh, okay. This guy, I like him. I like that he's spending an hour talking to Ido, and I've watched some of his stuff since, and I've been up and down with it. But this year, something changed with that show. And I'm wondering if you have any insight into or ideas of why someone like Brian can go from, you know, being a charismatic figure and a journalist and talking about things, but then going so hard, pivoting into the territory that he has with David and with the pandemic recently.
Yeah, that was an example of, it was really disappointing to see, because I don't know what it's like in the States, but in the UK, spirituality and spiritual teachers don't get much play. They then, you know, the BBC hardly ever features anything on spirituality, positive or negative. Likewise, our kind of intelligent media don't really feature anything on spirituality. So I like these, you know, relatively professional YouTube channels, like London Real was, that would be a platform for people I respect, like Rupert Sheldrake, say. Graham Hancock, I'm not so sure, but definitely I respect Rupert Sheldrake. And likewise, you know, the channels like Rebel Wisdom, it's like, you know, it's a good platform for spirituality, transpersonal psychology. So again, yes, it was disappointing when London Real, you know, kind of went full conspiracy. I don't know him, so I don't know why, but I wonder if it, I think there's a certain market dynamic and there's a feedback of audience and kind of likes, which can reinforce certain behavior. And I think a lot of influencers learned this year, they kind of started dabbling with conspiracy stuff, and they learned that they could really monetize it, that there could be a huge audience. You know, we have both kind of had success just writing about secondhand about this kind of phenomenon. So if you're in the belly of the beast and kind of saying, you know, tapping into that anxiety and suspicion and distrust and need for alternative stories, you can get a huge amount of likes and views. So I don't know if it was as cynical as that, or whether he, you know, he genuinely believed the kind of, you know, that COVID is a hoax and so on, and that the government is trying to control us. But I mean, I don't know how many views Plandemic got, but it was millions, no? And then around the same time,
8 million before it got taken down.
Yeah, and I remember there was this silly Pizzagate type documentary called Out of Shadows around the same time.
Yeah.
And it got it also did so well and got millions of views. So, and I think that's what lots of wellness influencers and Instagrammers, you know, they just experiment. Oh, if I put kind of COVID hoax, or if I put where we go one, we go all hashtag, I get loads of likes, and you know, and maybe half of those likes are Russian bots or whatever, but you know, suddenly they go from getting 1,000 likes per post to 10,000 or more. So I think there's a feedback loop whereby they might even, you know, really start believing it because it's being so affirmed. And I think what's so interesting about these conspiracy theories is they are cult-like, but they're not like a normal cult, because a normal cult is controlled from above in a very authoritarian structure. and your beliefs and your behavior is very controlled and so on. And whilst this is much more decentralized, I think people are being radicalized very quickly through kind of algorithms and feedback loops and social media bubbles. So it's not like there's kind of people like a cult leader, I think, exactly pulling the strings. Or maybe there is. Maybe there's a room of KGB agents, who came up with QAnon. But I think it's more like it's actually just tech algorithms designed to keep us watching
Yeah.
that is actually radicalizing people.
Yeah. You write about universal basic income as one of an interesting idea for real social change. And that's something I think about often. We brought it up in the episode on child trafficking, where I linked to at least 10 organizations that are actually doing work in the field. And I interviewed someone who has worked in that field for a long time, compared to the hashtag, I feel like I'm doing something, actually doing real work. And I also wrote an article during Andrew Yang's campaign about universal basic income being an antidepressant and how that would actually help mental health across the board. So you mentioned, first of all, in America, wellness influencers probably have outsized influence comparatively. We don't have anything like the BBC, for example, which I love and respect, and the different layers of it. But in the UK, do you see pushback for people actually trying to tackle QAnon and these conspiracy theories, and what sort of work are they doing besides combating disinformation to actually push social change forward?
You mean tackling the kind of economic roots of it?
Yes.
Well, I mean, not much at the moment. We've had, I think the government is trying to keep the economy from collapsing. So there was like what they called a furlough scheme, where they would pay companies to carry on paying people rather than laying them off. But we're seeing huge, every day, thousands of people being made unemployed. So it's pretty worrying, because we're in the equivalent of like 1929. We haven't even got into the 30s bit yet of kind of chronic unemployment and hardship. And so if you're worried about extremist ideologies, it's pretty worrying, because we saw what 2008 created in terms of polarization and the strengthening of the far left and far right. So yeah, I mean, and we're not even seeing much in terms of anti-disinformation campaigns. Like, I think people are just beginning to kind of clock, that conspiracy theories are an extremist ideology as a proper political threat. It's still a bit weird even to talk about conspiracy theories. So in mainstream politics, it's only in the last kind of month that you see articles about kind of QAnon, that conspiracy theories have gone a bit more mainstream. And when people talk about them, they tend to just say, God, how ridiculous, how absurd. So there's a detachment, I think, between mainstream politics, which and people who are into mainstream politics, and they're quite rational and evidence-based. And the problem is that this is just what they see about kind of spiritual people, as it were. So they will easily write off all of spirituality as just kind of woo-woo and dangerous and quasi-fascist. And they will say, oh, if only we were just more rational. We need to just be completely rational and secular and evidence-based. But there's a problem with that too, which is it's not a very satisfying narrative. People want something more meaty. People want something more mythical, something that gets them in the heart, as rather than just in their rationality. So it's funny. My brother wrote a book called The Myth Gap, talking about how we needed more than evidence-based politics. We needed kind of powerful myths to speak to our hearts and souls. And it's unfortunate that the myths people have kind of gone for are these, you know, conspiracy myths. I mean, this is what they are. They are myths that giving meaning to people's lives, but they are pretty toxic myths. But the solution to that is not just complete disenchantment. It's to try and find a more kind of healthy myth, a more healthy form of enchantment. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually write about towards the end of your piece about what happens when a vaccine for COVID-19 happens. And if we keep going on the path we are, and in America is indicative of this, a lot of people won't take it. What else besides a vaccine do you see as as the stakes? Like, what is going to be damaged if we keep going down this path of constant conspiracy?
What else is going to be damaged? I mean, the center ground of politics, the ability to trust that you're someone who disagrees with you might just disagree with you, but it's still worth kind of listening to and being treated with respect. If that goes, I mean, I think you're already seeing it in the States. Like,
Oh yeah.
that if someone disagrees with you, they don't just disagree with you, they're an existential threat to your core values and your core identity, and there can be no talking with them. An existential threat must be destroyed, and it, you know, and so you kind of see militias in the street. Yeah, that's what it's, I guess, is at stake, is democracy.
That's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah, in a much smaller way, like I think what's great is what you're doing and what your podcast is doing, and what I've been involved with, and others, is the attempt, and it's not quite as high stakes, but it's still important, and it's involved in it, is to try and um, take care of our culture, which just this culture of spirituality, and to try and keep it healthy, because otherwise there could be, you could look back at this year and think, God, our culture really failed this test. Like, in difficult times, it went off, you know, the reservation, and was actually didn't help our society. It actually harmed our society. So I think it's great that you know, your podcast, and now, like, we see yoga influences like taking a stand against QAnon, um, and I think it's trying to develop a kind of balance between spiritual intuition and critical thinking. So it's trying to develop a kind of critical spirituality, and I suppose to some extent a kind of, you know, centrist liberal spirituality as well, because there is this lure of right-wing and particularly far-right spirituality, which has a long heritage and history. If the center and the left aren't giving people soul and myths, and that kind of thing, then the right will, and the far right will, you know, they will capture that by saying, oh, the left is soulless, materialism. Only we can give you kind of soul and myth and heroism and meaning. So I think it's, you know, it gives me hope, the fact that, you know, your podcast's doing well, and like influencers are stepping up, and it gives me hope for our culture.
And you're writing as well. You're I don't know the metrics, but just in terms of, you can tell a medium on Claps, your recent piece on Nazism and spirituality doubled what I see on the first piece. And so I feel like you kind of put it out there and then you kept going with it, which I love. And it's so important. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about those parallels that you found between what's happening now. Well, you wrote specifically about the 60s, counterculture and Nazism, but you can extrapolate from that and put it to now. So when did that come into your head to tackle the Nazis and show how dangerous all of this is?
Well, again, it was like I was just doing my research for this book. So me being a kind of a bookworm nerd, just burrowing away, and I got to the point in this life of Aldous Huxley. I got to World War II, and I was interested in. I'm interested in the history of the human potential movement, and I saw that some of the ideas in the human potential movement and in Western spirituality were also popular in Nazi Germany. So I was just looking at that, and around that time, there were a couple of anti-lockdown rallies. There was one in Berlin, and there was one in London, where you saw both New Age figures and far right figures. A friend of mine in Berlin shared a photo on Facebook of this woman with a flower making a heart sign with her fingers, and she was also holding a Prussian flag, which is very popular with far right people. So, you know, and people were saying, what's going on? Why is there this coalition between like New Age hippies and the far right? And it was so I wanted to just say in this piece, we shouldn't be too surprised by this. Like, this has happened before, and I basically drew on particularly on the research of a historian called Eric Kurlander, who wrote a book called Hitler's Monsters, looking at the popularity of occult ideas and of alternative spirituality in the Nazi era and with certain Nazi leaders. So it's quite a controversial debate with historians of the occult and historians of Nazi Germany. But it's certainly the case that some leading Nazis were very into what we would call New Age spirituality, particularly Heinrich Himmler, who the head of the SS, who like always carried a copy of the Bhagavad Gita and wanted to get his leading SS soldiers to do yoga, and was fascinated by Tibetan Buddhism and sent a kind of Nazi explorers to Tibet to try and kind of gather its wisdom. Rudolf Hess as well, the deputy Führer, was very into alternative medicine and various ideas from theosophy and anthroposophy. He even had inmates at the Dachau concentration camp working on growing alternative medicine, and there were actually kind of experiments, non-consenting experiments on inmates in Dachau to try and find like herbal cures for cancer and things like that. So there were things like the Nazis set up, supported institutes for parapsychology, a pendulum institute. So there would be people, swinging pendulums over maps of the North Sea to try and discover enemy positions. So that all this kind of stuff, and none of this was, there was also things like the Nazis would draw on conspiracy theories as well. They saw Jews, or they describe Jews often using supernatural language, like they are demonic or vampires. They are engaging in these kind of blood rituals. There are these all-powerful kinds of hidden people who control the world. And then they also had this guru, kind of messianic view of the Führer as this person of great spiritual insight and power who would channel the will of the people and kind of heal the land. So the point of the article was it was called Nazi hippies, and I think again, like both those pieces, in a way, it's a lesson in what goes viral. It's just very useful to have just a very short, catchy title,
Mhm.
So like whether it's conspirituality or Nazi hippies, but the piece it got very widely shared. It was the most read piece I've ever written, the most read kind of essay, and it got translated into different languages. Um, and what one dark thing was, there's even a far right kind of bookshop and clothes shop, and they even made a T-shirt, saying "I'm a Nazi hippie." So they
Wow.
turned it into a kind of thing of pride
Wow.
with a kind of tie-dye Hitler. So
Wow.
quite dark, yeah. But you know, I guess, and I got a certain amount of pushback from people in the New Age community who, can often get ridiculed by mainstream culture for being woo and so on. And they said, "Oh, so you're just saying that, if you're New Age, you're inevitably fascist. So every person who's New Age hippie is a fascist. So just because, a few leading Nazis were into Rudolf Steiner's theories of agriculture, then every follower of Steiner is a Nazi," which I wasn't saying at all.
Mm.
I said in the piece, there's a kind of New Age left, there's a kind of feminist occult. So there's all different kind of political strands, but there is a long history. It's not just the Nazis. There's a long history of kind of right-wing spirituality and a far-right spirituality, and many beloved figures in New Age spirituality were pretty right-wing, if not far-right. Um, Joseph Campbell was anti-Semitic. Mircea Eliade was kind of very connected to the Romanian far right.
Yeah.
D.T. Suzuki flirted with kind of with nationalism, um, uh, and in some ways, it's part of the popularity of Jordan Peterson. I would say is he's that kind of right wing spirituality, heroic values, quite military, but a sense of like re-engaging with myths and traditionalism. Um, so that's what it was about, and I guess I'm still thinking about those issues, and I'm probably going to write a piece later this week, just talking more about right-wing spirituality and far-right spirituality, just to explore that idea for my own interest. I mean, for example, are you in the States, Derek?
Los Angeles, yes.
Los Angeles, yeah. So as you probably know, like Steve Bannon, the kind of the dark mind behind Trumpism, is very into the New Age spirituality, and he's into the occult, and he's particularly into a school called traditionalism, and a writer called Julius Evola, who, and these traditionalists were very into the perennial philosophy and so on, but they were I mean, certainly Evola was also quasi-fascist. So it's good to just be aware, like we can have this idea that New Age spirituality is always progressive and left-wing, and it sometimes is, but it sometimes isn't.
It makes me think of the term from psychedelics talking about Huxley, non-specific amplifier, which is what psychedelics are. They don't inject you with something, they bring things out of you that were already there. And
Right.
you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita earlier, and that's
Yeah.
obviously a very big one in modern yoga circles, especially here in California. And sometimes when I hear people talk about it, I wonder if they realize that it's part of the greatest war epic ever written. And
Yeah.
that in the Gita itself, Krishna is instructing Arjuna to go kill his friends. Like, that's not a metaphor. This is with the time that it was written and the tribalism that existed. It's very real. And yoga was very much a way of calming yourself before battle. So
Yeah. And that's why Himmler loved it,
the
because
way
it
that
would.
we experience it here is this sense of privilege that we can go to Whole Foods and then yoga, and then, well, not right now, but in general. But yoga served a very different purpose for a long time. Now,
Yeah.
you mentioned a little pushback, and you got a little bit on my page as well. And I wanted to close with this because I think it's an interesting way that people view writing in their own voice all the time. I like conversations because you can hear the inflections in our voice and pantomimes, and you can see the person, but you can't do that in writing. And when I posted your the Nazi hippie article on Conspirituality on my own page, some people brought up the fact that you brought up Black Lives Matter, which is obviously a very sensitive subject here for a lot of reasons. Rereading it a number of times, I think you're completely right in the sense that you were just pointing out that the ability to go into extremes is not a right wing issue. It's left, right. It doesn't matter. It's this slide into cultish thinking. And your overall tenor was just think critically about these things. And I wonder if you can close. We've talked so much about the right, but maybe talk about some of the ways that the left move into the same ideological mindset where they go so far to their side that it does become extreme.
Well, for example, I think we're in a breakdown of the old technocratic bureaucratic order. And that's leading to the rise of charismatic politics on right and left, which can mean, for example, a kind of ascribing or assigning almost magical powers, and a kind of completely, they can't do anything wrong. And if ever they get criticism in the press, it's because the press are the lying press and the evil press. So we saw that here in the UK there was a bit of a cult around Jeremy Corbyn. He could do no wrong. Any mistakes he made was the evil press. And he would also have these kind of rallies as well, where we're extremely emotional, almost kind of ecstatic. There was a podcast here by Novara Media recently about the cosmic right, worth having a look at because it's talking about this kind of overlap between conspiracy theories and kind of right-wing thinking. And they interviewed Eric Davis, the great religious scholar.
He'll be on our podcast soon.
Yeah. But this podcast that they set up was originally to promote an idea called acid Corbynism, which is basically psychedelic Corbynism. And in the early episodes of the podcast are these pictures of this boring man who's completely out of his depth against this kind of psychedelic background, as if he's like, the Messiah, or as if he's Timothy Leary, rather than just a really boring, sorry if anyone's listening and they're a fan of his, but like, in other words, this was like, it was similar. It was the cosmic left and a similar kind of charismatic cult. And these people are still going, Jeremy, he was such a great leader, like he did the worst in an election for years. In terms of Black Lives Matter, it's tricky for a kind of foreigner to comment, as because you're more likely to get it wrong, American politics, than to get it right. But I mean, in a way, like when you see it here in Britain, there's it reminds me a little bit of the kind of in times of trouble and in times of plague, you get all these different weird charismatic cults rising. And one of them in the Middle Ages was a cult of flagellants. So people would go through the street beating themselves. And the idea is, through punishing themselves, they would purge the land of plague and of evil. And when I see a procession of white liberals kind of ritually abasing themselves and saying, I have been racist in thought and in word and in deed. I'm literally kind of quoting some of these kind of public declarations. I have not been an ally. I have been violent in my thoughts. And there's this kind of, ritualistic self-flagellation right at the time of a pandemic. And I just wonder if there is some of the aspect of that. Maybe that's unfair. But there's also what you see is a kind of elimination of the gray zone. That's a comment that that was ISIS's strategy. Eliminate the gray zone. So you're either for ISIS or you're against them. And you see that in Trumpism. Either you're for us or you're against us. And you see that, say, in kind of BLM protesters marching through Portland, ripping down American flags and saying, either you're with us or you're against us. There can be no in between. So this is the kind of polarization of politics, and black and white thinking. I suppose there are definitely differences. It's probably a bit less supernatural in a way, and than the QAnon.
Yeah.
But even, it's funny when the left lost the election in the UK so badly, they came out and said, oh, it was because of the oligarchic press. If we could only free the people from the evil oligarchic press, rather than the fact that actually British people are just quite center right. So if you have a far left program, you're probably going to lose. So that, in other words, they had their own conspiracy theory. I just want to always say one last thing though, because it goes back to a point we were talking about earlier about non-specific amplifiers. But just while we're talking, we can end on it. It was like, I think there is a certain kind of idea which came out in California, and you can find it with like Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley, was if people just have a mystical experience, if enough people have a mystical experience, society will be renewed and will become liberal. So if enough people take psychedelics and have a mystical non-dual experience, we will overcome our egocentricity and fear and prejudice, and we will become kind of liberal. And you still see this idea in kind of like MAPS, for example, which is a psychedelic organization. If we just give people non-dual experiences of oneness and interconnectedness, and we'll realize, we're all one. But I mean, there's real problems that, like the Aztecs, that culture was a psychedelic culture, and it was highly hierarchical and based on human sacrifice. So they were doing lots of psychedelics and they didn't become liberals. Likewise, the Nazis had very much this sense of interconnected ecological vision of humans as part of an interconnected ecosystem. And again, they weren't liberal. So I think it's this idea that if we just have this right experience, everything will be better. And so in other words, it's a politics that puts too much emphasis on special experiences as being enough to kind of heal the world. And they're not, because unfortunately, as people like Charles Manson showed, you can have lots of special experiences and still be pretty like dark in your politics.